The two big political stories today are linked, and together they tell us Anthony Albanese is finished as Prime Minister. His authority is destroyed. If he does limp on, it's as a broken figure. Today, for the first time since the election, Labor has fallen behind the coalition in news poll, 49% after preferences to the coalition's 51%, which puts an end to Albanese's fake bravado early this year as his government kept lurching from one crisis to another.
We haven't lost a news poll since I've been Prime Minister.
Well, it's lost one now, and the government had to wheel out some poor schmuck to claim it was just a flesh wound.
No, look, I mean, there are obviously news polls where you're doing better than other times and others where you're doing less well. What we know is that Australians are doing it tough at the moment, and I don't think it's a surprise that we see that reflected in the polls.
No, it's much more serious than that, and not just because there's no sign that Australians are going to get a break from that cost of living squeeze that's killing this government, and no sign that the government has any agenda. The problem is Albanese himself. He's been exposed. He's been crippled by the very first promise he made on the night that he was elected, a wild promise that pleased the blind left but had nothing to do with helping mainstream Australia and little to do with helping Aborigines.
I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
And 1 year ago today, Albanese's dream crashed into ruins when 60% of Australians voted no to step one of that promise, Albanese's racist voice to Parliament, a kind of Aboriginal-only advisory parliament in our Constitution. Now, when you track Labor's news poll support since the election, you will see how disastrous that voice campaign last year was for the government. The government's support sank like a stone, and Albanese and Labor have never recovered. Now, that fall of Labor, I've got to tell you, is astonishing because Albanese once seemed unbeatable, the most popular Prime Minister in many, many years. As recently as April last year, his government was miles ahead of the coalition, 56% to 44%. And then came the collapse, all through the Voice campaign. And now this latest poll, they're behind. Now, of course, you will hear and have heard the obvious explanations, like here was Albanese spending all that valuable time pleading with Australians to back his voice to Parliament when he couldn't even explain it. And when so many Australians were preoccupied with just surviving this cost of living crisis instead, they were getting poorer and poorer, inflation punishing them. Here was Albanese, meantime, distracted with some leftist crusade of no good to anyone. It's a good explanation. I've used it often myself. But it still misses something important. And that's why, a year after the defeat of the Voice, Albanese is still broken as a leader. And that's because there was also how Albanese failed. Now, first of all, of course, he failed because of the same weaknesses that are behind so many of his other failures since. His failure to stop the collapse of his big global warming plans, his failure to keep energy prices low, his failure to protect Australian Jews, his failure to cut back on the disastrous level of immigration, his failure to keep homes affordable for the young and the poor. I could go on. All these failures and more explain why Albanese could now be the first Prime Minister since 1931 to lead a first-term government to defeat. And all those failures stem largely from the very weakness that was so cruelly exposed in the Voice campaign. And this goes beyond Albanese's terrible political judgment. He was also rudderless during that campaign. He was just like a passenger. He let activists advising the government walk right over him, pushing a model of the Voice that was so radical that most Australians, of course, would never accept it. And second, related, he had no command of the detail. Oh, this Voice, he said, was not about a treaty, or was it? This Voice was based on an Uluru Statement that's just one page, or was it? The whole thing was a mess, as Albanese was repeatedly contradicted by the government's own advisers on the Voice.
talking
This
about
is
the voice.
not about a treaty.
But as part of treaty, which we
This
guess
is-
will be a following step,
This is not about a
do you
treaty.
foresee that compensation would be
This
paid?
is not about a treaty.
The culminating agenda of the Uluru Statement is treaty.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart is one page.
So the Uluru Statement is actually 18 pages.
Albanese's Minister for Indigenous Australians was no better. Oh no, this had nothing to do with reparations, she told us. Yes, it did, said one of her advisors on The Voice, Thomas Mayo again, the Uluru Statement ambassador.
This referendum is not about reparations.
This is the first step. It's a vital step, and it puts all the explanation behind it. Pay the rent, for example. How do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations?
No wonder that the more that Australians heard of this complete schmozzle, the more they were against The Voice. And here's the thing. How often have you seen the same pattern revisited? Albanese didn't know the other day that his treasurer had asked for costings if the government cut back on negative gearing. Albanese didn't know early this year that boat people had reached Australia. Albanese didn't know he this year let in as a tourist the patriarch of a family in Gaza whose brothers and sons were Islamist terrorists. And this is a man now in Sydney that Albanese still hasn't thrown out either. And here is something not even his colleagues know now. What has Albanese really achieved in these 2.5 years? But more importantly, what does he want to achieve if he is elected again? Now, Albanese, after the last election, was the dog who caught the car. He won with no real agenda, apart from The Voice and his global warming crusade. And after the next election, what then? Will it be more wasted time, wasted effort, wasted money like we saw with The Voice?